All right, so MongoDB. When MongoDB first came out, it was really, really popular. And it kind of was similar timing with when Node.js became popular too. The fact that you could store JavaScript object or JSON directly in MongoDB, I think is one of the reasons why MongoDB and Node.js developers really like working with each other because the commonality was that JSON, the JavaScript object notation. Now, I frankly think MongoDB was way oversold. A lot of people were using SQL or relational database, and there was always this NoSQL database that existed out there. But I think the hype got too much, and everyone started using MongoDB because they thought it's the best thing in the world. But now people like shifted away from MongoDB. They're realizing that there are significant drawbacks to using MongoDB that they maybe weren't thinking of when they initially used it. But the reason I introduced this is for you to get familiar with MongoDB. Go in and spend maybe 20 to 30 minutes reading about MongoDB, play around with it. Don't spend too much time. I think it's an overkill. I think too many Node.js developers are using MongoDB for things that they should really use a relational database. So anyway, just study a little bit, maybe play around with it so that you can say, hey, I dabble with MongoDB also. Because if you like JavaScript and Node, the fact that you also dabble with MongoDB will resonate well with the JavaScript and Node.js developer community. So spend, a little bit of time getting yourself familiar. There are modules that you can use to work with MongoDB, such as Mongoose. And so you may study that and, play around with it. But I don't want you to be too overwhelmed with MongoDB. I think again, it is too hyped. Now, okay, so let me explain a few things about why I think it's a little bit too hyped. So regarding storing JSON object, you can store that neatly in MongoDB, but could you set up SQL, either Postgres or MySQL or Cassandra or MariaDB or whatever SQL database you're using? Could you also store JSON directly in a SQL database? And the answer is absolutely. You can store that as a text, right? You can also store that. Some of the recent databases also support JSON. So MySQL, for example, supports a JSON field for MySQL 8+. So you can also do that. So so it's just storing JSON in a database, and that's why you're using MongoDB doesn't apply anymore, right? Okay, so now here's another thing. And you may need to refresh on the difference between SQL database and NoSQL database. But, if you need to determine, should I use a SQL database versus a NoSQL database, you can do this kind of a thought exercise. So imagine if there's benefit on specifying what information you want the user to provide, like first name, last name, email, and so forth, then I think using a relational database is the way to go. If you already know what you want the users to provide for you. For example, if you're gathering user information, do you give them a sheet of paper that says first name, colon, and then fill in the blank, last name, fill in the blank, email, fill in the blank? If that's the type of information you want to collect, relational database is the way to go. But what if you want to give them just a blank piece of paper and say blank, colon, blank? Fill in whatever you want, right? If you want to type in your first name, say, hey, I'm going to put my first name and then write down your first name. If you want to write down full name, then do full name. So, if you want that flexibility to store anything, then you could consider, using NoSQL. Although, you could also do that, gather that as JSON and store that in a SQL database as a JSON field. So that's possible. But anyway, that's kind of a rule of thumb you can use. Usually, if you don't need to look up any other table, it's more like a document base where every single information, all the information you need will be in a single JSON object. Then NoSQL is often used, but again, you can also do that with SQL too. So I would say for the practicality of this training, I think it's better to focus more on a relational database. because the world is kind of really focused more on the relational, I would say, at the current point. But it wouldn't hurt to get a little bit of exposure to NoSQL database, play with MongoDB, play with their terminal, see how it works, see how you can, incorporate MongoDB with your Express. As long as you spend, I would say, less than 10 hours playing with this tool. Okay, so don't get too stressed, and if you're not ahead of the schedule, then you can completely skip this and you can come back and do this later on. It's not required. But if you're ahead, hey, it might not be a bad idea for you to also get familiar with MongoDB. So on your resume, you can also say, yeah, I've dabbled with MongoDB. Okay, all right, so that's that, and yeah, enjoy.